Welcome to tutorial number 2, Building Macro Rules in a Visual Macro Form. If you have not yet worked through tutorial number 1, then please go back to tutorial number 1, and design a form before commencing with this tutorial. If you are not already in the macros layout, just select the macros layout button in the ribbon. Now you should be able to see your macros library. OK, in the macro browser, select the macro form we built in tutorial number 1, then go to the Manage Macros tab, and select Edit Macro. Alternatively, we could have selected the Open Macro option in the Macro Workbench environment. Now we can see the form that we built in the first tutorial. And we will add rules to this form during this tutorial. Before we do, let's first tidy the form up a little with some of the tools available. Click the Form Designer tab. Then select the Set Form Title button in the ribbon. You are now asked for the caption you want to appear in your form. Type My First Macro and click OK. You will now see that the caption on your form has been set. You can see in the ribbon a number of fine adjustment buttons. In the last tutorial, you dragged new controls onto the form and roughly placed them into position. You can now use these fine adjustments to tidy up the layout of the form. First select a control on the form in the tree, then click the fine adjustments you require, such as nudge left, nudge up, etc., as I am doing here. You can also set the position of the controls with the aid of the Properties dialog, as shown. OK, now I am happy with the layout of my form. I will now begin to add some rules. Go to the macro tree and select the Rules node. Now right-click, and select Add Rule. If you cannot see the new rule node you have added, then expand the rule node by clicking on the tiny cross. You should see your new rule sitting directly under the parent rule. Again, select the parent node, and right-click, and add another rule node. Now select one of the new rule nodes that you have just added, and right-click. Now select the Delete option to delete this node. OK. Now let's look in detail at the properties for rules. OK. The first property we see is the rule name. Let's give this rule a meaningful name, such as check minimum height. The next property we see for this rule is trigger property. The trigger is the event on the form we want to run this rule on. The list you see is a list of all of the objects on the form. As I am going to be checking the minimum height in this rule, I want to run the rule when the user has answered the height question. So select height as the trigger to fire this rule. The next properties for this rule are the conditional properties. These are the properties that define what the actual rule is. For this rule, I am going to say that the minimum height for this macro is 500 mm. Firstly, select the form object, height from the list of form objects in the input control property. That is, for this rule we want to look at the value of the height question. Do not confuse trigger with input control. For example, we may have wanted the trigger to be on the clicking of the OK button. Triggers are what fire the rule, and the input control is the actual control on the form we want to look at the value the user has inputted. In our case, the trigger and the input control will be the same. Select height as the input control. Now select less than from the conditional property. Then type in 500 into the input value parameter. To summarize, we have set this rule to fire when the user has answered the height question. If the user has entered a height value less than 500, then this rule has had a true outcome. The next two property categories are the alerts and the actions. These two sets of properties are the instructions for the rule if the rule has a true outcome. Upon a true outcome, if we wish to display a message to the user, we enter the required message into the alert message property. If we don't wish to display an alert, then we simply leave this property blank. Let's now add a message that will be shown to the user upon a true outcome. Place the cursor in the alert message property field, and now click on the button to show the alert string editor. Now type the following message into the editor. You have entered a height less than 500 mm, please try again. Now click OK on the alert editor. That's our message set up. let's move on to the action properties. The action properties set the state of a form control. This can be its value or its enabled state, or both at the same time. In our case, if the user has entered less than 500 mm into the height control, we want to reset the control back to a blank value, so select the height control from the list in the action control property. As we want a blank value, leave the action value property blank. Now click the Save button, then click the Test Macro button to run a debug test on our form. Firstly, enter a height of 500 or greater in the height control, then hit the Tab button to move to the width control. We can see the rule has been triggered in the debug window. It has a red dot, which means the rule had a false outcome. Now enter a value less than 500 mm in the height control and move on to the width question. If you have set the rule correctly, you should be presented with your rule alert message. And you will see that the height control has been set back to a blank value. Notice your rule now has a green dot in the debug form, meaning the rule has had a true outcome. Now select the parent rule node in the macro tree, right-click, and add another rule. Select the new rule node in the tree to activate its properties, and change the rule name property to check maximum height. Repeat the conditional alert and action tasks. This time, we will set the rule for if the user enters a height greater than 1500 mm. Now save the macro and check your rules by clicking the Test Macro button. Let's go back to the macro tree and look at our rules. Notice from the structure of the rules in the tree that we have set a, or, rule structure. That is, if the height is less than 500 mm, or, the height is greater than 1500 mm. The user will be presented with a message, and the height control will be set back to a blank value. Any of your rule nodes can have child rule nodes underneath it. That is, if the parent rule node has a true outcome, the rule will firstly perform its actions, and then move on to fire its child rules. Those child rules may also have child rules, and so on. We call these rule gates. If a rule has a true outcome, it opens the gate to fire any rules beneath it. When a rule node has a child node, this gives you a AND condition. This type of logic is called AND, OR, logic. We already have some OR logic on our rules, so now let's add a rule with some AND logic to our form. The rule we are now going to build will set the minimum allowed width, based upon the user's panel type selection from the choice list. We will say that if the user has selected type 1 from the choice list, that the minimum allowed width will be 600 mm. We will set the trigger for this rule to fire on the OK button. Have a try on your own now to build this rule. Once you have finished, your new rule structure should look like this. Finally, save the macro and test the rules in the debug mode. Now try experimenting with some rules yourself, combining and/or rules to build complex rule sets. The next tutorials will show you how to build the automation tasks so you can drive applications from your macro forms.